especially thrilled to have Andy Finland here with us to give the talk, which, of course we planned at our post-PA meeting, which was canceled, but this will be one of a number of our events, monthly events that Network is going to have that you'll hear about and hopefully you'll join in on as we move forward through the fall into the spring. So I have the privilege of introducing today's webinar speaker, Andrew Finland from Penn State University. Andy is Assistant Professor of Public Policy, Sociology, and Demography, and an affiliate faculty member of the Population Research Institute at Penn State. He's a sociologist and demographer by training and studies health disparities, population health, policies in health, and methods. And the policies part, especially at the state levels, is what we're particularly interested in hearing his thoughts on today. Prior to joining Penn State, he was an assistant professor in the Department of Health Services Administration in the School of Public Health at the University of Maryland. And prior to that, worked as a senior service fellow at the National Center for Health Statistics. Andy's past research has focused on a number of pressing public health topics of importance in the United States, including racial and ethnic and socioeconomic disparities in health, immigrant health and mortality, cigarette smoking and mortality, and more. And his current research addresses topics including the effects of HUD housing assistance on health, healthcare access, and neighborhood attainment in the United States, using data from HUD and the National Health Interview Survey, among other topics that he's working on. I've always found Andy's work exceptionally important and interesting, methodologically sophisticated, and very well packaged. I love reading his papers. Today, he'll be talking with us about emerging demographic divides, US states, policy, and geographic divergences in life expectancy. And then before turning it over to Andy, please use the chat box if you have questions along the way or at the end. And then in the Q&A afterwards, Andy and I will monitor the chat box and address as many questions as possible. So turn it over to Andy Finland. Thank you again, Andy, for sharing with us today.
Thank you so much, Bob, for the introduction. And I want to thank everyone for being able to be here today. I see we have more than 40 people who showed up, and I really do genuinely appreciate it, because I think all of us know what times are like these days and how scarce our free time has become, given childcare responsibilities, given general concerns about the world. So I really do appreciate people coming, especially on the eve of Labor Day weekend. So the talk I'm going to give grew out of a request from Jennifer Montez to present on geographic patterns and divergences in US mortality that I was supposed to give as a keynote address for our network meeting after PAA in Washington, DC. As we all know, that meeting was canceled, and so we weren't able to meet. I was really looking forward to seeing everyone and chatting, but I was really glad that that this talk wasn't for naught, that we're still going to be able to have a conversation about this topic, which I'm not sure if it's possible, but I feel like it's grown in importance since PAA was canceled. So in thinking about the topic of US geographic patterns of mortality, I think it's really important to start with the broader context. And so thinking about trends in US life expectancy in the recent past. And so if we look back as recently as the early 1990s, US life expectancy, I think this graph is for US men's life expectancy, increased gradually. So we're doing better in most years, gaining life expectancy year over year, and generally it's a positive trend. Starting in 2014, we see something more concerning, that life expectancy declined, which having that happen in any year, even a small decline, is concerning. But more concerning is that this trend wasn't a one-year blip. It continued for several years. And I think maybe the first time we've seen life expectancy gains, it was finally again in 2018. And so we dealt with 3 to 4 years of persistent decline. And the declines were small, obviously, but any decline at the national level is really concerning. And I think to bring it into even more context is the decline is concerning. Then if you look at this trend, spread out over the past decade or so, we've essentially seen no real increase in US life expectancy since 2010, which itself means that the 2010s in some ways could be considered a lost decade, that we really didn't see continued improvement in life expectancy that we'd been accustomed to seeing for the past 30 years and of course much longer. And so I think it's led some demographers and people who do work in this area to kind of claim that American life expectancy is in peril. This got a lot of press. In some ways, I think the average educated American is now aware of this trend of US decline in life expectancy. But this is part of generally a more concerning trend, which is that US life expectancy itself is significantly below that of its counterpart countries. And so if we look at life expectancy in other high income countries, we're 3 to 4 years below the average, we're 6 to 7 years below the top performers, and we're below most or potentially all other countries that could be considered in this high income, more developed countries group. And that's problematic in a lot of ways, but I think what's more problematic and what brings into focus the recent year trends of life expectancy decline is that we're not closing the gap. That it's not like we're behind by several years, but we've started to move back into the game. No, we're not closing the gap. And in fact, potentially even worse is the gap has been growing somewhat gradually for at least the past 4 decades. Such that if you look back into the 1980s, US life expectancy was still below the average of other high income countries, but it was right in the middle of the pack. It was right there amongst other similar countries. But over time, as the US life expectancy has increased more slowly, and then in recent years as it's declined, we've really diverged from this group, such that if we were to climb our way back at the same pace that we've been falling behind, which itself maybe is optimistic, it would still take us another 40 years to get back into this group. And so this is a big concern for US life expectancy, especially given the fact that we don't necessarily see in the near future a lot of comforting trends, that we're actually confronting a lot of emerging trends that threaten to make this problem worse. COVID notwithstanding, I'm talking about things like the rise in midlife mortality, the drug overdose epidemic, and a lot of other trends that generally look worse in the United States than in our comparable countries. But I really don't want this topic to demoralize you. I think in some ways, explaining the reality of where US life expectancy is means that it's time to identify where we want to go, where do we turn for positive examples of improvements in life expectancy and population health. So if we decide now we're 3.5 years behind the average of other countries, we'd like to get back in that group, where do we turn? Well, one obvious place, right, is Canada. So Canada has a lot of similarities with the United States. Same continent, former British colony, a relatively long history of immigration. But at the same time, Canadian life expectancy is significantly above that of the United States. There are a huge number of policy differences. And so policymakers and demographers have often turned to Canada as an example of how to do it well. But another place we could turn is Europe. I mean, certainly in terms of identifying safety net policies that we want to see enacted in the United States to improve population health, Europe provides a lot of different potential regimes to examine. And life expectancy in most of Northern and Western Europe is significantly above that of the United States, although there is a fair amount of variation. what we've seen sometimes in this literature comparing US life expectancy to life expectancy in other countries is a focus on Japan. Japan has, for at least the last several decades, been the world leader in life expectancy. And so in some ways we think Japan must be doing something right. Japan hasn't always had the world's longest life expectancy, and so it's not as if it's baked in some way. Japan life expectancy is so much longer in Japan than the United States that I think in some ways this comparison can make people more demoralized that there's no way we're going to make back this 7-year gap. And one area that I think gets left out of this conversation is potentially turning to places within the United States for positive examples of improvements in population health and life expectancy. And so in thinking about this question of turning our focus inward and looking at geographic units within the United States, I think it's important to think of US states as having 50 US life expectancies. Right, so there's 50 states, and not that I want to exclude the District of Columbia, so I guess we could say 51 US life expectancies. And there's a ton of variation. So US life expectancy is not a unitary value. Life expectancy varies significantly across US states, such that the top performing US states are very close to the world leaders. So we have life expectancy in Hawaii that is pretty close to some of the top performers in Europe, like Italy and France, and above some of the top performers outside of Europe, like Australia. Life expectancy in California and New York is very close to the OECD average. So this sort of practice line of where potentially we would like the US to re-enter the pack. California and New York are already there. And then moving down the list, we have Massachusetts, which has life expectancy pretty close to that of the United Kingdom. And then the US average is similar to life expectancy in states like Texas and Pennsylvania, which falls somewhere between life expectancy in Poland, Turkey, and Hungary. And then towards the bottom, we see that life expectancy in some of the poorest performing states, Kentucky, Mississippi, West Virginia, are very close to, or in fact lower than life expectancy in Mexico. And this data come from the US mortality database. I'm not sure if anyone has used this. It's relatively new data set provided by folks at Berkeley who run the human mortality database. And it provides life expectancy by state going back to the 1950s. And so I think one lesson to take from this set of comparisons is that we don't necessarily need to look outside the United States to see populations that are doing it right in terms of gains in life expectancy. And what we've seen is that states not only differ in their level of mortality, their life expectancy, but also in the size of the inequality in mortality that we see. And so mortality by education varies significantly across US states. So Jennifer Montez has done a good amount of work in this area, showing that in some ways what characterizes states that have better mortality experience than others is how they treat their least advantaged education groups. And you can see that in this video. But the current geographic pattern of mortality that we see today is actually a product of the past 40 years or so. So the pattern that we see today is by no means persistent. It hasn't always been this way. And so the table that I showed you a few slides ago of life expectancy in states compared to other OECD countries, it's not always been that way. So things have changed a lot since the 1970s. And especially since the late 70s, states have started to play a more significant role in policy innovation. So we get a little bit more movement at the state level in terms of policies that can impact population health. So, for example, if we look at life expectancy in West Virginia, this is women's life expectancy going back to 1980. We see that there's actually been almost no change in women's life expectancy in West Virginia over the past 40 years. And this is staggering. I mean, I knew that West Virginia is currently sort of one of the poorest performing states in terms of mortality, but I really wasn't prepared for just how staggering this graph would look. That there's been essentially no real gain in life expectancy for 4 decades. And this is where, and when we compare the experience of West Virginia to other states, this is where we really start to see the divergence kind of brought to life. So if we look back in the 1980s, life expectancy in New York was pretty much what it was in West Virginia. There was essentially no difference, somewhere between 77 and 78 years. But while West Virginia has seen essentially no gains in life expectancy over this period, gains in New York have been rapid and consistent, such that the gap in life expectancy now is about 6 years between New York women and women in West Virginia. So looking more broadly, we can track trends in mortality across US states from the late 1970s to the present. And so when we look at the geographic pattern of mortality in 1977, it's in some ways tough to characterize the geographic pattern here. It's maybe potentially high mortality in the East, low mortality in the West, and maybe sort of high mortality in the Ohio Valley states and high mortality on the East Coast. It's sort of tough to characterize this with one pithy sentence. But it is interesting to note that there's a cluster of high mortality in states in the Great Lakes Midwest and the Northeast. So centered here kind of on my home state of Pennsylvania, but we have high mortality also in New York, New Jersey, Maryland, Ohio, West Virginia, and Kentucky. And then we also have a cluster of low mortality states in the upper Great Plains and upper Midwest, North Dakota, Minnesota, South Dakota, Iowa, and Nebraska. Now, fast forwarding 20 years and things have changed. Now in some ways, this map looks a little bit more familiar. This might be something that we would see if we looked at a map today. Not exactly as we'll see in a second. But the cluster of high mortality has moved from the north to the south, such that now we have this large contiguous cluster of the worst off states centered in the South, so especially in Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, but also to other connected states such as Louisiana, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Georgia. But then we still see this sort of cluster of low mortality states in the upper Midwest. So again, Minnesota, the Dakotas, Iowa, and Nebraska. And so even as the cluster of mortality disadvantage has moved to the south, the cluster of mortality advantage has remained constant in the upper Midwest. And so now, fast forwarding again another 20 years to 2017, we notice a few other changes that if you blinked might have been easy to miss, because the cluster of high mortality has remained in the South. So it's still there. I'll go back real quick to 1997 and do that again. So the cluster of high mortality in the South, still there. So it's still Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Oklahoma that are contiguous and holding the mortality disadvantage pretty constant. But one thing we've noticed in terms of now the cluster of low mortality states is that has started to shift. So it's left the upper Midwest, and now it's settled in the Northeast corridor. So New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts now have settled as the top performing states in terms of adult mortality. And following that same pattern, we see that there's growing disadvantage in mortality. So states falling in the ranks in the Great Plains and the Mountain West, places that had previously been among the top performers. And we can see this pattern actually pretty clearly if we just look at the magnitude of mortality decline over the previous 40 years. So looking from 1977 to 2017, we can look at which states have experienced the largest mortality decline. So the darker colors here are the smallest declines, the lighter colors are the largest mortality declines. And the largest mortality declines have been clustered again in the Northeast. So Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. And then also in a few other states throughout the US, including Illinois and California. At the same time, perhaps not surprisingly, the smallest mortality declines are observed in southern states, especially in the central southern states, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia, but then also kind of bleeding into the Great Plains and Mountain West states. So we see Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and even if we're coming out of the bottom 10 into the next quintile, we're seeing that a lot of Great Plains states fall into that group as well. And so in trying to characterize these trends, I developed sort of three categories for which states, three categories for state trends since 1977. And the first group of states is something that we have been talking about in literature for a little while, which is the sort of southern states that have fallen to the bottom of the heap. And so I call these the sort of early fall behind states. This graph is showing state mortality rank, so 1 being the best mortality, 50 being the worst mortality, from 1977 to 2017. And so what we see if we look at this pocket of states, Kentucky, Mississippi, Oklahoma, Alabama, Tennessee, Arkansas, Missouri, and North Carolina, if we look back into the 1970s and early 1980s, these states certainly weren't at the top of the heap. But they were, squarely in the middle, ranging from ranks 20th to into the 40s. But what happened over the course of the 1980s and early 1990s is they essentially all fell to the bottom of the heap. And that's what we saw in the maps of the pocket of disadvantage falling to these southern states. And this disadvantage has remained in place if we look to the present. And so this is previously, I think, where a lot of my work in this area had stopped, was focusing on this southern disadvantage and the fact that it's remained in place for at least the last 20 years. But a new group of states that kind of stood out to me was this other group of Great Plains and Mountain West states that had started to sort of fall in the rankings beginning in the 1990s. And so I call this group the late fall behind. And this group is a little bit different from what we see from the early fall behind states, because these were very clearly states that were at the top of the heap as recently as the early 1990s. So Kansas, Idaho, Utah, Nebraska, Montana, Iowa, Wisconsin, and South Dakota. I mean, these were in the top 15 states in terms of mortality. But beginning in the 1990s, they'd all started to lose ground, such that now they're sort of squarely in the middle of the heap. South Dakota is still doing relatively well, but as you can see, it has lost some ground along with the rest of these states. And so I think it's important to keep in mind that the geographic pattern of US mortality doesn't just involve which states are doing the worst. That's important to consider, obviously, but I think we also need to take into account which states are doing the best or no longer doing the best. So I started with the bad news, the early fall behind and the late fall behind groups of states, but I think it's important also to keep in mind the good news. So there's a third group of states that has seen sort of consistent progress in terms of mortality. So these states have risen in the rankings. And it's funny to say risen when the lines are going downward, but you understand what I mean. The rankings are getting better. And so I call this group coastal improvement. So these are our coastal states. Illinois is in there, which is not on a coast, obviously, but it's on the coast of Lake Michigan. So maybe by some stretch of terminology, we could consider it coastal. But the other states such as Delaware, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Connecticut, New York, and California are states that have pretty consistently been doing better over time since the 1970s, and then especially since the 1990s. So each of these states gained more than 20 places in the rankings, but I think it's really important to focus on two particular examples here. New York and New Jersey, which if you look back as recently as the early 1980s, could be considered disasters in terms of mortality. They were in the bottom 10 states in terms of mortality. New Jersey itself was close to last place. But since then, their fortunes have changed. So New York rose in the rankings from 44th to 3rd. And New Jersey rose in the rankings from 47th to 10th. And so it's just sort of staggering improvement in these two coastal states, but they're by no means unique. I mean, we see the same thing if we look at other states on the East Coast, as well as California. And I don't have the District of Columbia on here, but you'd see sort of a similar pattern in DC, that it was for a long time by far at the bottom of the heap in terms of mortality, but since then has risen towards the middle of the pack. So now that we have kind of the description of what's happened, these three groups of early fall behind states, late fall behind states, and the states that have actually pretty consistently seen improvement, it raises the question that what explains this divergence of fortunes across states within the US? An explanation that I've done some work on, and then I've seen probably most often in literature on this topic, is health-related behavior. So things like smoking, obesity, and much more recently, the opioid epidemic and drug overdoses. So I published a paper a little while ago now looking at the contribution of smoking, at least specifically to the diverging pattern of southern states moving towards the bottom of the heap, and found that it makes a pretty big contribution. So if you look at places whose rates of smoking-related death have stayed high, while other places have started to decline, you see that there's a pretty high cluster in states in the Central South, so Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, and Kentucky. And clearly this pattern has played out somewhat differently for men and women. So because men started to see declines in cigarette smoking earlier, the divergence happened earlier between the South and the rest of the US. And because women didn't see major declines in smoking until the 1990s or so, you don't see that divergence until the mid-1990s. But it's clear that smoking is playing some sort of role here. And then Jana Veerboom published a paper a couple of years ago showing kind of a similar pattern in more recent years, and breaking it down to kind of metropolitan area types and showing that there's been a pretty significant divergence in lung cancer and respiratory disease mortality between coastal areas and areas in Appalachia and the Central South, even in recent years. So even in the 2000s and 2010s, we see this pattern continuing. Obesity has pretty clearly played some sort of role in at least the movement of mortality disadvantage to the South, and the fact that the South's mortality has stayed relatively high since the 1990s. So if we look at this map of which places saw significant declines in cardiovascular disease mortality, we see that the pattern is pretty strongly, is pretty similar to what we see across states in all-cause mortality. And so the pockets where there were significant declines in cardiovascular disease mortality, the Northeast, the West Coast, even some areas in the upper Midwest, we see relatively large declines, whereas we see much smaller declines, and in some cases, really no progress against cardiovascular disease in pockets of the Central South. And particularly we see it in Kentucky. We also see it in Oklahoma and Arkansas, and moving up through the lower Great Plains. One cause of death I think that has gotten more attention geographically as of late, and for good reason, obviously, is drug overdoses, and particularly since Ann Case and Angus Deaton's work on rising midlife mortality among non-Hispanic whites in the US. And if we look at the states that, or the parts of the United States that have seen really significant increases in midlife mortality, the map looks pretty similar to what we see in terms of all-cause mortality decline. And so that is to say that this pattern of increasing disadvantage throughout a lot of the South in terms of all-cause mortality might be related to causes of death that have grown among non-Hispanic whites in midlife. And in Case and Deaton's original work, they kind of pointed to a lot of different potential causes of death that were driving this pattern. But I think it's pretty clear that at least in very recent years, a lot of the sort of staggering trends are attributable to increases in drug overdose mortality as the opioid epidemic has really taken hold. And so in some ways it seems like we would want to attribute a lot of the patterns that we see to rising mortality from drug overdoses, because this is something that has been happening a lot recently, and it's geographically patterned. But I in some ways, I think I'm a little bit skeptical that the drug overdose epidemic is driving much of the sort of broader geographic trends and divergences that we're seeing. Because if we actually look at places where drug overdose mortality is clustered, it doesn't really bear that much resemblance to some of the maps that we've seen. So drug overdose mortality is actually very high in a lot of states on the East Coast. So in New England, it's very high. In Pennsylvania, it's very high. New Jersey, it's very high. And throughout the South, not quite as high as what you see in the Northeast or parts of the Mountain West. And we really don't see much growing drug overdose mortality in some of the states in the Great Plains, like Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, South Dakota, that have started to fall behind in recent years. And so obviously the drug overdose epidemic has had a really negative effect on US mortality as a whole. I'm not sure that it's really a good culprit to explain some of these longer term geographic trends. So Shannon Monnet has done a fair amount of work describing the US geographic pattern of the drug overdose crisis. And she's made the point, which I think potentially adds some support to drug overdoses as contributing at least in some cases, to the geographic patterns of mortality that we see, that a large fraction of US counties have some sort of opioid overdose crisis, whether it's prescription drugs, whether it's heroin, whether it's fentanyl, or whether it's a large combination of many different types of opioids. But again, I think it's really important to notice where the geographic clusters in a lot of these things are. And especially in New England seems like a place that's experiencing a particularly heavy drug overdose crisis, but has seen relatively positive trends in overall mortality over the past 40 years. But also I think explanations that rely on health-related behaviors like smoking, obesity, and drug overdoses don't need to necessarily be considered in isolation of other processes. That Shannon Monnet has actually done a lot of work making the point, I think pretty convincingly, that drug overdoses should be viewed as reflections of wider socioeconomic, employment, and political trends. That just because health-related behaviors are explaining some of these patterns at a proximate level doesn't necessarily rule out other more broad explanations. So what else might explain the divergence of fortunes in mortality across the US? One potential explanation that struck me somewhat recently is the role of cities. So specifically the role of the American urban resurgence. So in the past 25 to 30 years or so, life in many major American US cities, major American cities has changed significantly. And the fortunes of many of these cities has changed. So crime has declined in most large cities pretty significantly. And crime has often declined in some of the highest crime areas of these cities more than in lower crime areas of these cities. Economies have often improved and employment has grown in a lot of big cities. And at least in some cities that saw pretty large population declines during the second half of the 20th century, population growth has returned to a lot of these places. And obviously I don't want to generalize about US cities to too broad an extent. I mean, to be sure, this process of urban resurgence, of changing fortunes of cities, has played out very differently in different cities. But I think it does make sense to call attention to the types of cities where we actually have seen this kind of reversal of decline starting in the 1990s. So a great paper by Irma Ello and colleagues a couple of years ago focused on gains in life expectancy among non-Hispanic whites across both regions and across metropolitan type areas. So comparing large central metros to suburbs, to small metros, and to non-metro areas. An interesting thing that they uncovered was that life expectancy gains were larger in large central metros of pretty much every US region. So we saw extremely large gains in life expectancy for men in the central metros of the Middle Atlantic, and so the Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey, the Pacific region, so the West Coast, and the South Atlantic, which is the Southeast. And what's interesting to note here is that gains in life expectancy between metro areas within regions were sometimes as large as life expectancy gain differences across regions. But this is really sort of focusing the gains in urban areas. And then I published a paper last year that looked at life expectancy gains at the city level in the United States since 1990. And I was really surprised to uncover in some ways really just incredible gains in life expectancy in several US cities. And so San Francisco, Washington, D.C., and New York all gained more than 10 years of life expectancy among men during this period. And then LA, Chicago, and Boston also gained close to 10 years, so more than 9 years. And these cities sort of look familiar. I mean, these are cities that are in some of the states that were the top performers over the past 40 years. And so it's interesting to note that we're seeing that same pattern at the city level, but it's much more extreme. So gains are much larger at the city level than at the state level. And just if we're comparing these gains to what we saw nationwide during this period, the difference is pretty amazing. So U.S. men gained about 4.8 years of life expectancy since 1990, and so some of the top performing cities are gaining 5 to 8 years more over this period. But we also see gains, we see larger gains among men, but we see pretty large gains among women, and significantly larger than gains for US women as a whole. But I did mention that this process played out differently across different cities. And so although there were a lot of US cities that saw larger gains in life expectancy than the US as a whole, there was a ton of variation across US cities. And so Washington, D.C. did significantly better than Baltimore. Chicago did significantly better than Detroit. Boston, Los Angeles, and San Francisco did significantly better than a lot of cities in Texas. And then there were, in fact, some cities that gained fewer years than the nation as a whole. And a lot of these cities are sort of clustered in some of the regions that, again, did not see rapid gains in life expectancy and declines in mortality over the past 40 years. And so just to kind of clarify the magnitude of gains in mortality or gains in life expectancy for some of these cities. We look at US men's life expectancy going back to 1944. US men gained about 14 years of life expectancy over this period, which is about the size of the gain in life expectancy in Washington, D.C. since 1990. So just to see how rapid the gains in some of these cities. And New York went from significantly below the national average to significantly above, and similarly with San Francisco, went from a large disadvantage to a large life expectancy advantage, and very rapidly. So finally, I think, again, something that is not inconsistent with these other explanations is the role of policy, and specifically the role of policy liberalism at the state level. So state liberalism is something that has made much more sense to consider in recent decades, particularly because since the 1970s, state mortality has, states have taken on a much greater role in policymaking than the federal government. So as we see federalism kind of becoming a much stronger force for social policymaking, we see the states taking on a greater role. And over this period as well, we see that state mortality has been increasingly patterned by state politics, such that in the 1970s, red states, so more conservative states, had a mortality advantage over more liberal states. But in the present decade, or in the 2010s, the opposite pattern emerged. So this is sort of an example looking at the Democratic vote margin in the presidential election of 1976 and 2016, correlated with the adult death rate. And so states that voted Democratic in 1976, on average, had higher levels of mortality. Not a super strong relationship, but positive. Moving forward to 2016, we see the reverse relationship, that states that voted more Democratic had significantly lower mortality than states that voted more Republican. And this relationship now is much stronger. So the correlation is significantly higher. And we see this pattern kind of play out over the previous 40 years. So if we rank states by how much they shifted from Republican to Democrat, so a rank of 1 on the x-axis is states that shifted towards the Democrats, 50 states that shifted the most towards Republicans. And then if we rank states by the amount of mortality decline over the past 40 years, we see a really, really strong relationship here between shifts towards the Democratic Party and improvements in mortality. And, you know, I haven't done any research on this explicitly, but Jennifer Montez has. She just published a really incredible paper in Milbank Quarterly that actually looked at the effect of policy liberalism on life expectancy at the state level and then tied it back to the US life expectancy disadvantage. So essentially showing that over the period from 1980 to 2015, states shifted in different directions according to their level of policy liberalism on a variety of policies. And so we see in some ways a divergence in state politics that a lot of states that were already kind of on the liberal end of the spectrum have become more so, and states that were already on the conservative end of the spectrum have become more conservative. And that this has implications for life expectancy. So a lot of policies are associated with life expectancy gains to the extent that states have the more liberal version of the policy. We see this across a lot of different policy domains, from unions and labor to health behavior taxes to environmental policy, reproductive health policy, gun control, and this is actually responsible for a pretty significant amount of the U.S. life expectancy disadvantage, such that, you know, if states shifted their policy regimes to be more in line with not with Europe, but with the policy liberalism of states within the U.S., we would see pretty significant gains in life expectancy. And I know that you're going to hear probably a lot more than I could do justice about state level policy and its relation to health from Rebecca Kreitzer next month. I do think it's important to consider this in the context of changing geographic patterns of life expectancy. So I think in looking at the past 40 years of changing patterns of mortality, I think there are some important insights that we can draw from this. One is that there's significant variation in mortality experience across geographic units within the United States. So I'm not sure that it's fair to consider US life expectancy as a single number without considering the variation across places, such that, you know, the top performing states have life expectancy that's pretty close to the world leaders, or at least pretty close to the average of high income countries. And the worst performing states have mortality experience that's similar to middle income countries such as Mexico. But things are also changing rapidly. So by no means do I expect the pattern of US mortality to look the same way in 2037. Things are changing rapidly, such that states that recently had been kind of considered top performers, a lot of states in the upper Midwest and the Great Plains have sunk in the rankings. But at the same time, we don't necessarily need to look north to Canada to see an example of positive improvement in mortality. We can look in some cases north, but north and east to the east coastal states that with large metro areas that have seen pretty consistent improvement in mortality, and as a result have risen in the US rankings. And then finally, I think it's going to be really important to pay close attention to cities over the next several decades. And I think some of the patterns that we see in states and mirrored in some of their large metro areas can help us out in terms of trying to understand what's really going on here. Because they might be able to explain both the role of favorable economic trends as employment and income in a lot of cities has risen, as well as progressive policy effects. And so we know that in the past decade or so, that city level policies have taken on a greater role. So as cities have become more progressive, they've started to do things like raise the minimum wage and institute paid family leave and institute paid sick leave. And obviously there's a huge problem with states preempting some of the policies of their cities, which we've seen in a lot of cases in more conservative states. But I think it's going to be really important to see policy development at the city level and how it plays out in geographic trends at larger units over the next several decades. And so just kind of a teaser on that front, if we look at the same cities that I showed you life expectancy trends for, and look at expenditures per capita in some of these cities, we see that the top 3 spending cities here should be very familiar: Washington, D.C., San Francisco, and New York. So in some ways, the best performing cities in terms of life expectancy gains are also those that spend a lot more on a variety of services. So again, I really want to thank everyone for showing up today. And I really appreciate the support. I know that all of our lives are hard. And so again, thank you for coming, and I look forward to continuing to talk about this.
Thank you so much, Andy, for a wonderful talk on giving us this both big picture, historical and spatial overview of life expectancy changes, and then for digging into the policy issues as well, and the other explanations that may be associated with these patterns and trends. So much appreciated. So as we move forward with the question and answer, right now, I don't know if you said there was one clarifying question to start with that's in the Q&A box. Alejandro Mora asks, does the female adult mortality include maternal mortality in all years?
Yeah, so yes, but no. So it's the female adult mortality measure I'm using is ages 55 and above. Just in order to capture trends among adults and older adults. And so if there were to be maternal mortality at those ages, it would show up in the numbers, but it's very likely to be extremely low. And see, Jason asks, have you or others used health distributions across states, interstate migration, to see how bad selective migration would have to be to explain state level differences in mortality? Okay, so that's a great question about the role played by migration across states. And clearly, if healthier people are moving to healthier states, or if healthy people are moving to healthier states for a variety of reasons, it could sort of exacerbate trends that are already ongoing. And so I don't have necessarily a good answer other than to say this is almost certainly happening. And to some extent, one would expect the selectivity to have gotten stronger over time as the states that have started to do well are states that have a lot of college graduates. And so probably most of the positive selection across state lines is going to be college graduates for labor migration. And so to some extent, you would expect that as labor markets in New York, Washington, D.C., LA, and San Francisco had become increasingly reliant on college educated workforce, that this process would be stronger. But as far as I know, I think the actual level of like long-term interstate migration has declined over time, such that fewer people live far from where they were born now than they used to. And I'm not sure if on the margins that's something that would change the level of selective migration and its contribution to these patterns, but it's something that's certainly been going on. I know that there are some folks who are working on this topic. I saw a paper by Noli Brazil at PA a few years ago, where he was actually trying to correlate levels of interstate migration with measures of population health. I think maybe at the county level, maybe at the state level, I don't recall right now. But there are folks who are working on this question, and I think it's an important one.
Okay, others?
Can I ask a question while Bob's looking at the Q&A? Andy, you probably know that NCHS produced the census tract level mortality and life expectancy files. Do you have a sense, like, how do you feel about that data? How do you feel about that effort?
I think it's absolutely worth doing. I think in some ways, if I were to be snobbier about the demography of it, it's in some ways tough to imagine being able to calculate stable life expectancy at this tract level without merging maybe a decade of data, which I think is what they do. So they use like a very long time series of death and population data at the tract level to calculate life expectancy, which is good. Definitely should do that. But in some ways, we can then miss trends that are going on, because if these things are changing over the course of 10 to 15 years pretty rapidly, we're going to miss that with by trying to get the kind of fine-grained geographic level down to the tract. But I think it's clearly informative, because looking across census tracts, you get much more variation in life expectancy than you get looking across larger geographic units. I think I've seen this, that within Baltimore City, there's like a 20-year gap in life expectancy between the best off and worst off tracts. And so that's extremely informative, but in terms of thinking about how larger geographic trends play out, it's tougher, because you're just not able to get enough deaths to calculate life expectancy year over year.
It made me think about it because you mentioned in one of your last slides looking at maybe cities. I also wanted to point out, you can't get the trends, but RWJ's county health rankings also, they do their own calculation of county level life expectancy, and the Washington group might as well. I just want to remind people that the network has a call out right now for proposals, which something like county level life expectancy would be a perfect, right in the wheelhouse, or metro, or it's any kind of meso area between state and census tract or neighborhood. So I just want to plug that, because that deadline's coming up kind of soon.
That's a great point.
Andy, you have a question from Barbara Entwistle in the chat. She's asking, what about immigration? To what extent has a differential increase in the foreign-born population across states contributed to the trends you described? So it's related to things you've been chatting about a bit, but more so focused on immigration itself and the state level trends.
Yeah, no, I think that Barbara, that's a really good point, especially because just eyeballing the states that have done very well over the past 40 years, they're immigrant-heavy states. So New York, New Jersey, California, and kind of taking a sort of basic compositional approach, immigrants tend to have better mortality outcomes than native born, and so areas that are taking a lot of immigrants would potentially expect to see mortality improve, even if it's kind of just compositional. And I would say to some extent that is happening, and it's definitely happened in California, because if you look at I think if you look at California's ranking in terms of overall mortality, it's like second to Hawaii. But then if you look at California's ranking for non-Hispanic whites, it's like not bad, but it's somewhere maybe like 20, 25. And so there's clearly this contribution of immigration to the mortality experience of some states. One thing I will say though is that if you zoom down to the city level, Sam, Preston, and Irma, Elo looked at life expectancy in New York from 1990 to 2010 and found that gains were actually larger for US born than foreign born in New York. And so although New York has taken in a lot of immigration over the past several centuries, but also increasingly from all over the world since the 1990s, that's not necessarily driving the trends that we see.
Next question, thank you, Andy. Next question from Jennifer Brooks, asking about how does research account for the effects of race? For instance, how do we know that these trends aren't just indicative of some communities rather than others?
Yeah, that's a really great point. And I think there's a couple ways to think about it. If you think sort of at the macro policy level, race and racism clearly plays into policy that states, for a variety of racist reasons, have in some cases neglected to invest in health and welfare policy that Jennifer's recent paper has shown actually leads to increases in life expectancy. And so I think in a lot of states that have where policy has kind of been held back by racism, or white people imagining that investment in the safety net is going to benefit African Americans, you end up kind of stunted on adopting policies that we know now could be really beneficial. At sort of a lower level of answering this question, race is clearly a concern if life expectancy gains are being concentrated among whites, and gains are not going to African Americans or other people of color. And clearly that this happens in some contexts, but not nationwide, and not in a lot of the states that we're talking about. So if you look across the US, the Black-white life expectancy gap has declined over the past 25 years or so. Over the past 40 years or so, it's declined only a little bit. It reached a maximum in the 1990s. But then if you also look in a lot of states on the East Coast, the Black-white life expectancy gap is close to zero, or in some cases actually reversed. And so it sort of by no means does increasing life expectancy need to mean that we're increasing disparities as well. And I will say also in a lot of the cities that I looked at in my cities paper, we saw larger gains in life expectancy for Blacks than for whites.
Andy, I'm going to ask you to speculate a little bit. The decade of the 2010s was lost decade in terms of life expectancy. Now we start off 2020 with COVID, and surely we're going to decline in life expectancy in 2020 when the data finally come out. Knowing what you know about what has unfolded with COVID across by geography and looking ahead into the 2020s, can you speculate a little bit what would be your hypothesis about will states have larger gaps as we look to 2030 or 2037, based on, you only got a little bit of data for 2020, but what do you think?
So I would say I'm actually pretty optimistic about the future of US life expectancy, and in some ways of US policy related to things that can improve life expectancy. And that might place me outside the mainstream, but I actually think that we potentially reached a point where we're going to see kind of a change. The US has fallen so low that now most people are aware that US life expectancy and US health indicators don't look good. And so I think there's this growing constituency potentially for policies that are aimed at actually improving population health. And we've seen this recently that Debbie Wasserman Schultz came out with a bill to develop a group to study US life expectancy and to determine ways to improve it. And so I think in some ways, maybe these conversations are finally making it into the political mainstream. And obviously at the states, there are some more concerning trends, but as Jennifer's paper showed, there's also some really positive trends that we see, that states that are instituting more liberal policies in terms of social welfare and labor and reproductive health are actually realizing gains in life expectancy. And so although maybe maybe we won't zap back to being in the middle of the pack by 2037, maybe we're going to start to see diffusion across states in some of the policies that have realized gains for the coastal states.
Thank you. I hope you're right. We'll see. Yeah,
We'll see.
I hope you're right. Carmen Gutierrez has a clarifying question. She asks, you are referring to the black-white gap in life expectancy. Are you referring to the life expectancy at age 55 plus?
No, so I was actually kind of implicitly referencing a paper by Sam Harper, I believe, who looked at the black-white life expectancy at birth gap across not 50 states, but across maybe 38 states from the 60s to the present, showing that life expectancy at birth in a lot of states on the East Coast had the gap had been narrowed to nearly zero.
I have a question, and this relates to the purpose of the network. So thinking forward, what do we need in order to, be successful on the next frontier of this research on, figuring out why we have these growing disparities in life expectancy across cities and states? What do we need as a research community to push that forward? Is it different kinds of data, different data linkages, new methodologies? How could the network help us all collectively push this research forward?
Yeah, I think it's creative uses of existing data. But there's a ton of data out there not collected for purposes of examining geographic patterns of mortality. And with the right approach, we can link it and start to answer new questions that previously weren't possible. So I'll give you an example. I was running a panel for the upcoming IPHS conference, and the three presenters each were using linked data sets wherein one of the linkage pieces was not collected for any population health purpose. So one person was linking temperature data to birth outcomes, and the people who collected the raster temperature data did not do so that we could look at potential impacts of climate change on infant health outcomes across the US. But with the right approach of being able to get access to the restricted birth data and doing that linkage, we can answer a question that might have previously been considered impossible. And then one other guy was linking longitudinal surveys to the 1940 census to get an idea of where people were growing up, and then linking that to information on lead contamination in their places of birth, and so look at the sort of long-term and geographic differences in implications of lead exposure for health and well-being in later life. And then another guy was linking new oil well development to data on air pollution and birth outcomes. And so it was really nice to see these sort of questions that we, maybe a decade ago would have said something like, what a great question that needs to be answered. We just need better data. And it turns out, I think in a lot of these cases, the data are out there. And I would be among the first to argue that perhaps the federal government should make it a little bit easier for us to access these data sets. There's a lot of red tape. But to the extent that we go through that red tape, there are a lot of opportunities out there to make use of existing data to answer really important and previously unattainable questions.
Yeah, that's a great idea, and that's really important. Even before getting to the issues around access, we have issues about just simply knowing that these data sets exist. And so maybe there's a need for the network to create a data catalog on the website.
Yeah, and
People
you
know
are
about
identifying it.
We're doing it.
You did that to some extent, or I've used it a little bit. I used some of those data sources for this presentation, actually, the sort of state level indicators database, or whatever you called it.
Yeah, I mean, so I couldn't get this ready in time for this webinar, but in the next month or so, actually on the website, we're finishing the data resources page. We have a separate tab for kind of state, just below state, and like very local neighborhood kind of data. I'm actually going to be hopefully getting like some focus group kind of, is this what you need? Is this what can help you? I also wanted to let people know who are on the webinar who maybe aren't as familiar with the network that we do have a lot of data producers. I think I saw Rob Warren on the call. He's worked on the 1940 census data linkage and is very knowledgeable about it. He's linked it to a bunch of studies, including HRS and CHAP.
Yeah, I should have called Rob Warren out because I think he was.
And he works, I think, probably with the person who had the lead data, and I forgot that fellow's name, unfortunately. But it does, I think, bringing up IAPH is a good point, because I think we also need this kind of big tent mentality. Like I'm working with some people on weather data right now, and it took us a while to figure out how to put those data together. And it's not something a sociologist demographer could do necessarily. But I'm actually glad you answered that question the way you did, Andy, because Jennifer Muntz has put together really great state resources that'll be on the website, and I and some other people have worked on more local resources. So we are hoping to kind of make these data connections a little easier for people. And then I think the last thing we have to do is start putting people together. Like Andy needs to get together with someone else, and someone else needs to get together with someone else. It's exciting. Let's make it happen.
Indeed, I'm on board.
Does anybody else have a question to ask Camarino, Salazar? Can you share the name of this resource site?
This is on the NLCHDD website, but the resource page has not been resolved yet. It will be soon. And so long as you are a member and you're on our listserv, you'll get an email saying that there's been a new addition to the website. If you're not on our listserv, I guess we can put in the Aging Network email. You should let us know. We can add you as a member to the network. You'll get all the emails from that point.
Jennifer, is it just nlchdd.org?
This one, I'm having a problem with my internet.
I was going to put it in the chat box.
Yeah, I'll put it in there.
While we wait for that, are there any other questions? There's the website, beautiful new website. Jennifer has really spearheaded the development of that along with students that she's working with, so thank you. Any other questions for Andy?
There's one here from Alejandra Mora. Do you think climate change awareness has influenced coastal improvement observations? Potentially. I would in some ways take the easy way out and defer to people who are better able to answer policy related questions. I'm a demographer, so I do the mortality side and think about how policies impact mortality, but I'm not as well versed in how policy comes into being.
So I can speak about this just in terms of the port in LA, which is one of the biggest ports in the United States, the Port of Los Angeles. We also have the Port of Long Beach. They're basically the same place, but we have someone who works in USC who used to be the director of the port. She started what was called Greening the Port initiative. And our emissions at ports are really high, and this has been a big problem for life expectancy, obviously, and health as well. So she did a lot of effort. I don't know how much of it was driven by a focus on climate change, but the fact that she called it Greening the Port suggests that there is some connection. And this was things like penalizing old diesel trucks and incentivizing through a grants program that was funded through the penalties of the old technology, the purchase of new trucks, and also just things like not letting ships idle out in the bay while they're waiting. There's a tremendous traffic jam that happens at the ports. So I think if that happened in LA, that's probably happened in other coastal cities as well. I'm guessing.
I'm Thank you, Jennifer. I missed a question here. VGE Cannon asks, it's in the Q&A box. Andy, in addition to your point about focusing on cities, recently I've been thinking about understanding how federal policy differentially affects states and cities. The current administration has made a point of punishing blue states by removing the SALT provision in the tax code and various other policies such as disaster relief. I don't know whether future administrations will adopt these biases, but it could influence life expectancy in a state regardless of the state's own policies. Just wondering your thoughts on that.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. Federal policy has differential impacts on state outcomes. And so just an example would be federal policy that is good for cities, for instance, would benefit certain urban states more than rural states. But I really do think that state level policy making and state politics as well sort of dominates the equation these days. And we see this with a great example of federal policy making, which is the ACA, that played out very differently across states according to policy. I mean, so now, thankfully, maybe 40 states have expanded Medicaid, but we'll still see this, state level policy difference contributing to what was ostensibly a piece of federal legislation.
Thank you. Okay, I don't see any others. We're kind of running out of time, so I don't know if Andy, if you want to offer any last thoughts, or if you're done. Yeah, I totally get that as well.
I mean, if no one has any other questions, I don't have anything else to offer other than I hope that we can start to see some of the improvements in the better performing states spread across other places.
Again, thank you so much for your talk today, for all the thoughtful preparation and delivery and answering questions and your participation in the network. It's much, much appreciated. And
thank you.
Thanks for everyone for coming on board today. Again, you saw the website for the network. Also want to again re-advertise that Jennifer Elsher mentioned earlier. Our next monthly event is scheduled for October 2nd at 1:30. So you'll get notices about that. Rebecca Kreitzer from UNC will be talking that day, and more so on state policies. And again, we'll continue to have these basically monthly kind of webinars as we wind down 2020 and then start up again in 2021. So,
Bob, I just want to make one point.
Feel free to close down too. I'm done. That's it. So go ahead, Jennifer.
I want to just remind everybody we had to switch the October 2nd webinar to October 9th.
Thank you. Okay.
And I also just want to say before we sign off, the pilot proposals are due October 12th. That website link, it has all the information about pilot proposals, including an FAQ that Jennifer Montez put together.
Okay, so the pilot proposals due soon. What's the date on those?
October 12th. I just checked the website.
Okay, and 9th for the next webinar. Okay, great. Okay, thank you all. Thank you, Andy, in particular. Thank you all for joining, and we'll see you next time.